Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Middle-earth and artificial intelligence, a combination as classic and delicious as pickled herring and strawberry jam. So find a comfy seat and we'll get rolling. If you've been on the internet at any point in the last 3 to 4 years, you will have noticed some of the ways that AI is making the world weirder. The recent explosion in generative AI tools has changed how we think about almost every area of human endeavor, and it has dropped some steaming ethical and philosophical quandaries right in the lap of the everyman. Now, some uses of AI look like unqualified wins, such as when it helps biomedical researchers more quickly predict the shape of protein molecules, or helping to decipher scrolls that were charred beyond legibility hundreds of years ago during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. By the same token, other uses of AI seem pretty clearly abusive, or at the very least cringeworthy. That would include things like uncritically accepting what Google's AI overview tells you is the truth, using ChatGPT to help you more efficiently research how to commit crimes, or presenting an AI-generated song or image or dissertation as the product of your own knowledge and effort in order to enjoy unearned benefits. But while many instances of AI scumbaggery are highly visible, there are also a lot of gray areas that we now have to contend with. For example, imagine someone with a profound speech impediment using an AI voice generator to create a voiceover to give a presentation. That seems like a pretty clear example of technology helping to overcome a disability. But would our opinions change if the person was simply compensating for the very common fear of public speaking? What if they just really didn't like how their own voice sounded? Fortunately, if there is one person in recent history who has way overthought the potential problems and dangers of accelerating technological progress, that would be J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I thought it was high time to ask the question, what would Tolkien have thought of AI? Now, I'm willing to bet that a significant number of you immediately thought that that is a dumb question with an obvious answer, namely that Tolkien would have hated AI, in the same way that he hated all quote-unquote modern technologies. That is to say, reflexively and viscerally. And as far as it goes, that's not a bad answer. Tolkien's fiction and his personal correspondence are full of his love for the natural and pastoral world, his grief at the damage caused by industrialization, and a distrust of something he calls the machine. And it's the kind of simple, zingy claim that does really well as a headline or a social media post, but it doesn't really do justice to the depth of Tolkien's thought on the issue. As you're reading The Lord of the Rings, it's clear that a categorical hatred of all things mechanical isn't the only idea its author was trying to convey. The view of technology presented in The Lord of the Rings is much more complicated than that. For every evil example, you can find a good one. The villains rely on ugly industrial applications that poison or desolate their surroundings, as seen in Mordor or Isengard. But one of the key traits that distinguishes elves and dwarves from men is their tremendous amount of knowledge and skill in fields like horticulture, medicine, architecture, metallurgy. This is generally portrayed as a good, or at least a potentially useful quality. Even the rustic hobbits are described as being clever with their hands. Long before Saruman arrived in the Shire to start making improvements, the Sandymans were already running their mill. In fact, many of Tolkien's characters display an outright reverence for the forgotten knowledge and arts of lost civilizations. From the beautifully made and perfectly hidden doors of Durin, the unfathomably colossal architecture left by the Númenóreans, ancient elven blades imbued with strange powers, even the Palantiri, the products of Middle-earth's most controversial inventor, all are described as wondrous as well as perilous, and not infrequently they give our heroes a much-needed boost in fighting the forces of darkness. As with virtually everything about Middle-earth, Tolkien gave a lot of thought to these various manifestations of craft and skill. And one of the observations that he frequently made was that it's not all that easy to distinguish technology from magic. In several of his letters, he mentions that, in his opinion, magic and technology really belong in a single category, one that he calls the machine. And in Tolkien's view, the perils of the machine are one of the major themes of The Lord of the Rings. The peak examples of this are the Rings of Power themselves, and as manifestations of the machine, the rings show several properties that are eerily applicable to the current AI situation. The first is that the power of any given manifestation of the machine is directly related to how versatile it is. Now, it's deceptively tricky to try and articulate how the rings of power are even supposed to function. The last time I tried, it resulted in a video that was nearly an hour long. And part of the reason it takes so long is because, apart from giving some wearers invisibility, but not all, and conferring general longevity, it's not all that clear what the rings even do. You can kind of use them for whatever you like if you know how to go about it. And actually, that very versatility is a big part of their draw. The second property of the machine that Tolkien highlights is the way it has an inescapable effect on its users. Using a ring leads to reliance on it and a gradual lessening of the user's own natural power. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of similar things happening today, from people turning to AI lovers as their relationship skills decline precipitously, to college students who claim that they don't even know how to read or write on their own. Third, whether we're talking about the One Ring or ChatGPT, the way you use the tool matters. If you don't use it very often at all, or you only use it for trivial things like avoiding your obnoxious cousins, then you'll probably get away with it for a long time. Probably. Nobody picks up the One Ring thinking they're going to turn into Gollum. In fact, when Gandalf first tells Frodo that Gollum used to be a creature very like a hobbit, Frodo is not only disgusted, but he angrily denies that such a thing could even be possible. But that's part of what makes the machine so seductive. It can seem trivial or harmless at first, and indeed it might be trivial or harmless, until you start using it for more and more advanced applications. Finally, in Tolkien's view, it's not just the user who determines the effects of a given device, because the intent with which they were designed shapes what they are capable of. This point is an important one because it works both ways, both for good and for evil. Sauron had a hand in making the 7 rings given to the dwarves and the 9 given to men, but the 3 elven rings were created by the elven smith Celebrimbor alone, without Sauron's input or, at first, even his awareness. In other words, the evil rings of power aren't evil just because they're rings of power. They are evil because they were designed by Sauron for evil ends, control by force and domination. The 3 elven rings are free from this corruption, so although it remains risky and potentially costly to do so, they can be used for good ends without necessarily turning to evil. This is why Galadriel, for example, can wield her ring Nenya for centuries without any obvious sign of becoming a ring wraith or worse, but is forced to reject the possibility of using the One Ring. This idea is an extension of Tolkien's overall views towards magic and technology. Generally speaking, he considers the devices and techniques themselves to be morally neutral. It's a combination of the user's and the designer's intent that determines good and evil. So Tolkien would likely have been very sensitive to questions like whether an image generator had ethically sourced its training set, or what exactly a company was doing with the data generated by its users. However, he probably wouldn't have been morally opposed to generative AI on principle, simply on the grounds that it was a newfangled, labor-saving device. But would he have endorsed its use? Would he have ever used it himself? To answer that, we have to look at the sharp distinction Tolkien made between the magic of the machine and the magic that is an extension of art. For example, the elves are among the most seemingly magical beings in Middle-earth, but in several letters Tolkien said that the elves represented the artistic qualities of humanity elevated to a supernatural level, and that the source of their power really lay in their art. Like Tolkien himself, the elves of Middle-earth are much more attuned to the difference between artistry and technology than they were to the difference between a so-called magical or non-magical method. This actually becomes the source of much intercultural misunderstanding, because for Tolkien's more mundane or grounded characters, extremely advanced uses of art and technology both look like magic. The elves, on the other hand, were much less easily impressed by what was being accomplished, and much more interested in how and why it was being done. You could attribute some of this to their extended lifespan. Anyone who can afford to dedicate 6,000 years to a subject is probably going to seem supernaturally skilled in it. But the elves functional immortality can't account for all of the differences between the elven and the mannish experiences of creation. In one letter, Tolkien described elvish art as delivered from many of its human limitations, more effortless, more quick, more complete, product and vision in unflawed correspondence. So for Tolkien, it wasn't the endless years of meticulous practice and attention to detail that made elven art superior. Instead, this inhumanly brilliant art is supposed to be natural, easy, and almost entirely free from the frustration of knowing that what you intended to make would have been so much cooler than what you actually ended up producing. And this is the part in the research process where I started to question everything I thought I knew, because Tolkien's description of elvish art looks remarkably similar to what generative AI promises. Say I wanted to write a poem celebrating a loved one or expressing gratitude for the beauty of a sunset. I could spend hours working on it myself, or I could ask ChatGPT to whip me one up in literal seconds. Depending on how bad a poet I was, it could match or even exceed the quality that I would be capable of creating. And with the power of iterative prompting, I could bring the poem closer and closer to my original idea. Which means that very possibly the AI poem would evoke the mood I was looking for and express my feelings better than I could myself. In other words, the AI-assisted experience would be quicker, it would be more effortless, and it would result in a product that was in more unflawed correspondence with my vision. So does this mean that the elves have just been using AI this whole time, and should we start using it too? Unfortunately, the answer to that seems to be no. But to find the reasons for that, I had to turn to Tolkien's lecture-turned-essay on fairy stories. There is a lot going on fairy stories, and it's essentially impossible to summarize the whole thing and do it justice, so what I've done is extracted the relevant points and explained them as best I can. The first thing to look at is Tolkien's narrow definition of the word imagination, which he uses strictly to refer to the mental power of forming images of things not actually present. Being a professional philologist and a pioneer of recreational language invention, Tolkien naturally identifies the human capacity for language as being hugely important in imagination. In his words, the human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. The mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. If it could do the one, it could do the other. It inevitably did both. This is the kind of recombinant subcreativity that our current generative AI excels in. When ChatGPT successfully fulfills a request for an image of a kitten with periwinkle-colored fur, or a unicorn riding rocket skates around the rings of Saturn, it appears to be using a process that's at least analogous to the one Tolkien is describing here as being the basic atomic unit of human creativity. Quick aside here, because I feel I would be remiss in not pointing out that Tolkien's idea that language is critical to this kind of process is another example where he is weirdly prescient about details of our current situation. Now, I do not claim to understand the science, but my understanding is that one of the big breakthroughs that kicked off the current AI boom was the use of large language models to finally hack natural language processing. And on a more fundamental level, any computer application you care to name was probably made with the help of programming languages. While these aren't exactly the same as a natural language like English or Latin or Sindarin, it looks like they use comparable structures to help organize and relate information. Now, while Tolkien agrees that imagination is very powerful, he says it's still only a part of what constitutes truly fulfilling art. For art to really be considered successful, Tolkien says, both the artist and the audience have to willingly enter a created secondary world, both of them agreeing to treat it as real in certain ways. Nowadays, you're likely to hear this quality called immersion. Back in the day, we used to call it suspension of disbelief. But Tolkien doesn't really love that term. He says you can't achieve this state by passively letting yourself be tricked into forgetting that something isn't real. Secondary belief is something you have to actively construct, motivated by the desire to believe in the kind of world that the artist or performer is presenting. I know this description makes it sound like it's only something that would apply if you were trying to write the next Game of Thrones, or maybe trying to finish the first Game of Thrones. But in this essay, Tolkien says that even a cricket fan watching a really good match could be considered to be entering a kind of secondary belief. While he is watching, he treats the entirely made-up rules as real and important. He can appreciate the relevance of the strategies and plays being employed, and he cares, sometimes very deeply, about the players, the teams, and the outcome. So really, the idea of subcreation and secondary belief has a pretty broad applicability. Now, having sufficient skill in execution certainly helps in achieving secondary belief, but successfully fooling someone about the nature and reality of what they're seeing is not art. It's the kind of magic that Tolkien associates with the machine. He says it is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. Notice that Tolkien never says art and magic use fundamentally different processes, or that they produce obviously different outcomes. Instead, it's the experience and intent of the person behind it that is really what he singles out. True secondary belief must be voluntary and collaborative. You can't fake it until you make it either. Both the artist and the audience have to be sincere in wanting to bring this little world to life. Tolkien says that creative desire is only cheated by counterfeits, whether the innocent but clumsy devices of the human dramatist, or the malevolent frauds of the magicians. Uncorrupted, it does not seek delusion nor bewitchment and domination, it seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. This is the key point at which generative AI falls short. While it can replicate the power of imagination, and even approach elvish levels of efficiency and technical skill, it can't make art, because the defining feature of art is not the product or the process, but the artist. So, if we were to apply Tolkien's principles to the conundrums of AI, we would not unthinkingly reject it as inherently immoral or degrading. We would still need to pay attention to how a given tool was being used, but we'd also have to be much more concerned with who designed the tool, what its original intended purpose was, and what kind of changes took place in the people who use it. And finally, while the imaginative powers of AI might well be very helpful in creative work, actual art would, by definition, remain a purely human function. If you enjoyed this video, let me remind you that hitting the like button is as quick, effortless, and complete an art form as we mortals are ever likely to experience. If you want to share in the subcreative world of my fevered Pronaldorn rantings, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to activate secondary belief. You can also check out the link to my Patreon if you are so inclined. If you are a returning viewer, you may be reeling from the knowledge that I do in fact have a face. Once you've processed the horror of that, let me know in the comments how you feel about this kind of video format, whether you love it or hate it or are distracted by the shape of my left eyelid or something. I'm open to all of it. Finally, tremendous thanks as always to my current Patreons who evince a very primary belief in my work and keep these videos coming. These include, but are not limited to, Rusandal, Rico Mariani, Hairhile the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., James A. McCormick, Gandalf the Grey, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, and Joel Byam.